As daylight broke on the 20th of February 1944, airfields all over Great Britain were busy preparing for a new mission that would influence the outcome of the Second World War. That mission was to defeat the Luftwaffe. The task was handed to the young men of RAF Bomber Command and the United States 8th Air Force to win the battle and become masters of the air. If they were successful, Operation Overlord, the invasion of northwestern Europe, could go ahead as planned. During World War II, British and American bomber crews played vital roles in strategic bombing campaigns against Axis targets. Although the two allies had differing views on the role of bombing, both agreed that degrading German industrial centers vital to their war machine was a key objective if they were to win the war.
Our target tonight, Berlin. Germany.
RAF Bomber Command primarily operated at night, targeting German cities and industrial centers.
You smashed Hamburg. You'll deal the enemy a blow from which they may well find it impossible to recover.
Went out of an egg tonight.
American crews, part of the 8th Air Force and later the 15th Air Force, conducted daylight bombing raids over occupied Europe and Germany. The crews faced immense risks from enemy fighters, flak, and adverse weather conditions. Their losses were appalling. Yet day after day, the crews would take off knowing that the odds of their survival were stacked against them.
Most of us were quite apprehensive about this, but on the other hand, you see, we daren't say we're not going to go because we would have been cowards. And if we said we weren't going to go, we would have been stripped of our brevet, we'd been stripped of our rank and everything, and we would have been LMF. And that's something which we couldn't have borne. So a lot of it, we flew, although we were fearful.
But their sacrifice was not in vain. Although it was the armies who took the surrenders and accepted the glory, it was the bomber crews who made victory possible. The last years of peace before the outbreak of war in 1939 saw a rapid expansion of the air forces of both sides.
All right now, you can go solo. Good luck.
Many young men in Britain had been inspired to learn to fly and had already volunteered for service in the Royal Air Force while they still had a choice, rather than wait to be called up into the other services.
Yes, I certainly wanted to fly. I did have a choice, fortunately, because I might have gone into the army, but I volunteered well ahead of conscription, although they didn't call me up for a long time. I volunteered, I think, originally at about the end of 39, but I didn't go in for nearly a year, like a lot of other chaps, of course.
Now, it isn't as if it was a chore for me to talk to you because I want to speak on my favorite subject, the Army Air Forces. I can't speak from long experience. I've only been in the service a year, but I've learned a lot about what the Air Forces have to offer. That's what I want to talk to you about.
It was a similar story in the United States. Although still maintaining a non-committal stance on the world stage, Americans knew that war was inevitable and had started expanding the armed services, including the Air Force.
Let's talk it over. Now, make no mistake about this thing, fellas. We're all going to be in this war soon, sooner than a lot of you realize. And nearly all the officers of this great Army Air Force that they're building today are going to be drawn from the ranks of you men, from high schools and colleges. Those who join as aviation cadets now.
College boys were encouraged to become air-minded and sign up for training schemes that ensured there would be pilots available when war came.
When I first went into the service, we didn't think too much about just going into the service. It was a big, big step. But the first thing when we went through the first door, the big sign on the door said kill or be killed, and that kind of gives you a jolt right there. And so that got you thinking a little bit on what you getting into here.
The Air Corps, which was later renamed the Army Air Force, or AAF, was made up of personnel who represented an unusually gifted and privileged group. For the majority of the war, Air Corps combat personnel were volunteers, reflecting the War Department's desire to staff the service with motivated personnel who believed in their mission.
I wanted to be a pilot, and I figured the only way I could get to do that would be to enlist and get my name on a cadet list. As far as getting training, I wasn't sure I'd make it, but that's what I was sure going to try to get.
If accepted, candidates' performance was constantly reviewed on a battery of aptitude tests to sort the young men into specialities before sending them on for training. The competition to become a pilot was fierce in both Britain and the United States.
You had your hard and fast rules you had to go by, and if you deviated from that too far, you'd be washed out. In other words, you did what they told you to do and trained the way they trained you. Any deviation thereof would be elimination.
For Air Corps pilots, the washout rate was around 40%. Inevitably, many were disappointed. But there was also a need for air crews to man the bombers.
Our CO come out one day and told us, all of you cadets who are wanting to be fighter pilots, you better think about changing your mind because we don't need any fighter pilots right now. And he says if you continue to ask for that as your first choice, a lot of you are going to end up as a flight officer pulling targets down in Arizona somewhere for young cadets to shoot at. And that scared me. So I changed my choice right there and went to multi-engine.
They also got into acrobatics to a certain extent, and this is where I flew real well, up until we got to acrobatics. Now, I'm talking about the airplane upside down, barrel rolls, spins, different acrobatic maneuvers, which was unusual. I could do them, but I didn't feel at home upside down or in violent turns or in spins. I could do them and had to do them, but I decided, hey, I don't think that I'm going to be a very good fighter pilot. So at that time I thought I'd take it in terms of piloting bombers.
One morning we're about, there might have been 20 of us on the course. 8 or 10 of us were called into the office and said, we've got more pilots than we know what to do with, dear boys, and you can be bomb aimers or navigators. Which do you wish to be? And I suppose I wasn't top grade in terms of my progress as a pilot. And I was broken-hearted. I can remember crying. So anyway, I thought, well, I'd rather be a navigator than a bomb aimer.
American factories were put on a war footing, turning out aircraft of every type, including the new Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 would form the backbone of the American bomber groups that started arriving in Britain during 1942. The story of the B-17 began in the early 1930s, when the United States Army Air Corps issued a specification for a new bomber that could fly faster, higher and farther than any previous design. Boeing responded with the Model 299, a massive aircraft with 4 engines and a wingspan of over 100 feet. But on its maiden flight in 1935, the aircraft crashed, killing 2 of the crew. Despite this setback, the Air Corps recognized the potential of the design and ordered a revised version, which became the B-17. It was heavily armed, with up to 13 machine guns, and could carry a bomb load of up to 4,800 pounds. Crews were expected to operate at altitudes above 25,000 feet, which presented two major problems: the need for oxygen and a means of combating the extreme cold. Arguably, neither was satisfactorily resolved until the end of the war. But it was the B-17E, with its improved engines and increased armament, that really made the Flying Fortress a force to be reckoned with. It was this version that arrived in England in July 1942 as the 8th Air Force began to build up its strength. Meanwhile, RAF Bomber Command had been mounting operations since the first days of the war. Flying twin-engine light bombers like the Bristol Blenheim, the targets were strictly military and were flown in daylight. The losses were enormous and achieved little. Following the fall of France in 1940, the RAF began attacking German factories at night. But plans to hit specific factories proved impractical as crews failed to identify individual factories in the darkness. Their bombs were scattered far and wide. It seemed that Bomber Command was just too small a force to be effective. Its heavy bombers were twin-engine types like the Vickers Wellington. Although crews appreciated its strength and durability, its range and payload were insufficient to inflict serious disruption to German war production. Even the arrival and service of the short Stirling during 1941 did little to improve matters. Although it had 4 engines, its operational altitude was too low, which made it an easy target for the expanding German defenses. A report into bombing effectiveness concluded that only around 5% of bombers were hitting their targets. German ground defenses were becoming more saturated around the industrial centers, and night fighters were also becoming more effective. Crew morale was at a low ebb.
We were very busy, and that was a mistake that the people in charge made. We were on a great number of raids over a short period of time, and I was getting more and more tired. I just couldn't sleep, which was probably a factor involved in my final being shot down by the Germans.
It was deadening, really. You knew that you were perhaps close to the target because you navigated as best you could, but you knew that within 5 miles or so you were hopeless. And in fact, most damage we did to the German war effort was killing their cows in the fields.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. For Britain, 1941 marked a low point in the war. Night after night, London and other British cities were being bombed by the Luftwaffe. In North Africa, early successes were now being reversed following the arrival of General Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps. Similarly, British and Commonwealth allies were on the back foot in the face of the Japanese advance through the Pacific. Having the world's most powerful country formally enter the war as an ally would prove decisive in the long term. It also provided a much-needed boost to morale. But there were still many battles to be fought, not least in the air.
The Nazis entered this war under a rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and half 100 other places, they put that rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
1942 marked a pivotal year in the European theater of World War II. The Allied forces intensified their bombing campaign against the Axis powers, aiming to cripple their industrial and military capabilities. The year saw a significant escalation in the strategic bombing efforts by both Britain's Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. The RAF, under the command of Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, focused on nighttime area bombing. This approach aimed to destroy entire cities to disrupt Germany's war production and demoralize its population.
Getting towards the end of 42, and we're still basically mainly on Ruhr attacks, known as the Happy Valley in those days. And it was a question of going into briefing each day and the same target would come up. It would be the Ruhr Valley, Essen, Dusseldorf, Dortmund, wherever. And it was always the same site. Oh Christ, not again.
To demonstrate its growing power, Harris ordered Bomber Command to assemble a force of 1,000 bombers for a single raid. It meant pulling aircraft and crews from many different units, including crews still in training, to build such an extraordinary show of force.
The only thing of awareness was the fact that we made up the number. That was about all we knew. Other than that, there was nothing really referred to, even in the briefing. They just briefed that we were going there and hope we get back.
Codenamed Operation Millennium, the target was Cologne. The raid was scheduled for May 30th. Its objective was to cause widespread destruction on a scale it was hoped might be enough to knock Germany out of the war or severely undermine civilian morale. The raid was the first to use a new navigation system called G, which enabled greater accuracy in finding the target. It was also the first time a new tactic was tried out. Called the bomber stream, the aim was to get a large number of aircraft over the target in as little time as possible and overwhelm the defenses. Previous raids had lasted as long as 4 hours. The new tactic saw the attack last just 90 minutes. The raid resulted in extensive destruction and marked the first time such a large-scale attack was carried out. It also showcased the Allies' growing air power and their commitment to strategic bombing.
It's a bit frightening because they'd been in, the big boys had been in, and it was on fire. Everything was, and we were struggling with a little 2-engine aircraft to get there, which we did. We got there quite well. In fact, the skipper was very good. We didn't know. I didn't know. The skipper didn't tell. I don't think the skipper knew, now we come to think of it, that question, that we were in a 1,000 bomber. There was some remark that we were going to make up numbers, I think, if I remember right. Somebody said, oh, we're only going to make up numbers on this lot. It was very, very impressive, I think is the word. I'm not quite sure, that you saw the whole thing alight, and
there were these bombs going down, and you could, particularly I was in the front, you could see them hitting the ground and things. I very nearly felt sorry.
Although RAF Bomber Command had been Britain's only means of striking back at Germany in the first years of the war, bigger and more powerful aircraft were going to be needed if Germany's industrial might was to be disrupted in any significant way. Powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the Lancaster had both the power and reliability to fly long missions deep into enemy territory.
I've always taken a great deal of pride in the fact that I flew Lancaster during the war. I have a great deal of admiration for it. It was a wonderful plane to fly. I think as an attacking weapon, it was probably one of the best as far as bombers were concerned. It could carry a terrific bomb load. It maybe could not withstand as much damage as a geodeck construction like the Wellington, those sort of things, except perhaps it could sustain quite a bit of damage from light flak, providing it was not too close. We had numerous occasions where we were peppered with light flak, with fragments of light flak, without causing any serious damage. But as a fighting weapon, I think, yes, it was probably the best the Allies had.
The following year, in May 1943, the Lancaster was to demonstrate its versatility. Operation Chastise, famously known as the Dambuster Raid, saw specially modified Lancasters drop bouncing bombs at extremely low level.
The opportunity to indulge in low flying, authorised low flying, was a real boon to most pilots. Enjoy low flying. Well, not all, I suppose, but most would enjoy low flying, and of course it was taboo to low fly unless authorised. And the opportunity to undertake low flying on a continual basis was accepted with a great deal of satisfaction from pilots.
Having been at 10, 12, maybe 15, occasionally, and sometimes at a push, and then the prescribed height was going to be 100 feet. Well, hey! For me, lying in the front, that was absolutely exhilarating. Just lying there and watching the old ground going woof, 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 straight past. Whereas sitting on top of these bloody clouds when you could see nothing until you got to the target, and then all you saw was rubbish.
Their targets were 3 dams in the Ruhr Valley in Germany's industrial heartland.
Turned down and went and approached the island of Veland, and I could see the breakers as I approached the island. I could see the breakers ahead breaking on this foreshore, and see the sand dunes above the level of the sea. And I gained a certain amount of height just to clear them. I must have been flying, I think I was flying pretty low, about 30 or 40 feet or something like that. And I flew to be on the safe side and had actually cleared the top of the dunes and was losing height on the other side when the line of tracer appeared on the port side and was hit by one shell on the amidships and on the Lang, which cut all the communication and electrical systems. And when everything went dead, I carried on and asked the wireless operator if he would inspect the damage and see whether it could be repaired. In the meantime, I was circling around in the Zeta Z, and when he came back and said no, at that stage we were communicating by lifting the flaps of our flying helmets. It was the only way we could converse, yelling in each other's ears. And when he came back, and said no, it couldn't be repaired, I made the decision that to return to base, and it was going to be, because it was absolutely essential. Navigation would have been extremely difficult without being able to communicate with the navigator and with the crew being able to identify targets. And even if we'd got to the target, how would the bomber have been able to direct me as pilot on the run up to the dam floor? So I believe I had no alternative, and reluctantly made the decision to go back, and had the dubious distinction of landing, the first one to land with a live bomb on.
I had 4 reasons for saying yes. I felt that the raid was successful. The first one was that it proved to Hitler and the Nazi hierarchy that what they thought was indestructible, the RAF could get through and destroy. The second thing was it did delay, not as long as we'd have liked it done to do, but it did delay some of his armament production. And the third one was that he had to bring in skilled workmen from other war work elsewhere to repair those dams. And I think the fourth, and possibly the most important, was the morale effect it had on the people of this country. I don't know how much we appreciated when we were doing the raid, how important it was. And it really probably wasn't until we saw the papers the next morning with its plastered all over the headlines. Christ, did we do that?
The success of the mission demonstrated the incredible skill and precision of the RAF crews that remains one of the most remarkable feats in aviation history. Meanwhile, the United States Army Air Force was building up its presence in England. Aircraft like the Boeing B-17 and B-24 were being ferried over in increasing numbers to their new bases in the east of England in preparation for their daylight bombing missions.
We call an officers' club. Just a little old shack, little bar in there, and it had a light in the back of the bar, had red and green on it. And as long as the light was green, you could go in at night and have a couple of drinks, and the green light meant no mission tomorrow. And some of those guys have sat there, and they have several drinks, and then all of a sudden, about 11 o'clock, pang, that light goes red. That means a mission the next morning. Everybody heads for the sack to try to get a little bit of sleep.
You went into the briefing room and you sat down, and the commanding officer came in and everyone stood up. I don't recall whether they saluted the commanding officer or not, but everyone stood up and he would then say, "Seats, gentlemen," and you all sat down. Then he'd pull the sheet that covered the target area off of the blackboard with a map of Germany on it, in this case. This sheet covered this target area, and when he did this, the whole group groaned, "Ah," like that.
The American strategy emphasized precision bombing in daylight, targeting factories, rail yards, and other critical infrastructure while trying to minimize civilian casualties. Although the crews faced greater risks from defending fighters, it was believed that they stood a better chance of finding their target.
Magnetic.
On August 17, 1942, the USAAF conducted its first independent raid on European soil, targeting rail yards in France. This mission was a milestone, demonstrating the America's growing capabilities and coordination with the RAF. back in the United States. Recruitment and training had substantially increased. Under the direction of General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Force, it expanded to become the largest air force in the world. He committed to training 100,000 pilots by the end of 1942, many of whom were sent to England to join what became the 8th Air Force.
We had our own airplane. Nobody got in that airplane, only us. You see them now, different crews fly different airplanes. We had an airplane issued to us in California, just before at Fresno, just before we got ready to leave. And that was our airplane. And we put our own names on it. Our aircraft had a couple of names. You know, everybody wanted a name, but the basic name, it was Miscarriage. Everything had a sting of humor to it.
I had a crew chief, the ground crew chief, and he came to me one day. The plane was not named when I flew it the first several times, and he came to me one day and said, "Would you mind, Lieutenant, if I named this plane Ruthie?" And I said, "No, that's fine." I said, "My mother's name is Ruth," and he said, "Well, that's the name of my girlfriend back in the States."
Tours were supposed to last 25 missions, but loss rates were so high that only around 25% completed their tours. The rest, 75%, were either killed, severely wounded, or captured.
Check at B-17, Chuck, 3 o'clock. Motor smoking. Fighters 10:30 coming around. Those 10:30 upper or lower?
B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock.
You guys get out of that plane. Bail out. There's one. He come out of the bomb bay.
Yeah, I see him.
Well, life expectancy of a flight crew was 16 missions. You didn't dwell on it. The chances of getting anybody out of an airplane was very, very slim. Very slim. Most generally, they just blow up. We got to 23 missions. We got shot down on our 23rd mission. So we went clear by the 16 and we were feeling real good. Kind of 2 more missions and we got it made. It didn't work out quite that way.
The odds of completing a tour and going home were small. But when a B-17 called the Memphis Belle completed its 25th mission, it and its crew were sent back to the United States. Once back home, they toured the country where they were celebrated as heroes. Memphis Belle flew its first mission in November 1942. It then flew strikes against targets in Germany, France, and Belgium. Despite the odds, the crew completed their 25th and final mission on May 17, 1943. Despite the appalling statistics, morale remained high.
I mean, I never had any problems, as far as I remember, worrying about getting shot down or worrying. Some guys would come in and say, "Well, if I get shot down?" I don't recall saying that. But I didn't think I was optimistic, but I thought this mother's son was going to get through.
Never worried too much about it. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen because nothing I could do about it. The only thing I did when the flak got real heavy, I'd spin the ball. I think if I'd spin the ball, that would deflect the flak, you know. I did hear some pings around, but the plane made so much noise and I could feel the concussions of the exploding bombs around you more than what you hear them. Because the plane is so noisy, you know? You hear a little rumble, that's all.
In the face of mortal danger, crews formed close bonds that brought together both officers and other ranks.
It was important, really, because we got to know each other, and we knew that if we were in difficulties, how people would react. And this was absolutely essential, because you couldn't have anybody in the crew who was not up to standard. And this was the testing point, really.
What makes a good crew? Primarily the pilot. And we had such confidence in Joe as a crew that it welded the crew together. We all gave him the best we could.
I think it gives, I think it's important that a crew operates as a unit. They fly as a unit. They trust each other and develop a spirit of camaraderie between the crew. I think is important to me as a captain, or was important to me as a captain, and also for completing successful operations.
Crew working together have to, first of all, have confidence in each other's job, particularly the gunners who are looking out, while we're in operation, looking out everywhere around the aircraft to keep the pilot informed of any fighter activity. And the navigator, you've got to have real great confidence in the navigator, making sure he knew where he was.
At this stage in the air war, bombers had to fly to their targets without escorting fighters as they did not have the range.
But the Germans didn't want to go over the target because of all the flak. That was the big shells come up, paint the sky black, trying to shoot down the bombers before they got over to drop their bombs.
Once over enemy territory, the bomber crews faced swarms of German fighters. As they got closer to the target, the sky was turned black by anti-aircraft fire, also known as flak.
Those black bursts that were out in front of these planes were flak, and these black bursts were 88mm shells that burst into pieces of shrapnel that goes in every direction when that explosion occurs. We could not hear it in the cockpit because it had engines between us and our earphones on, but the men in back, even though they had the earphones on, could hear the bursts and hear the flak sizzle as it went past the aircraft.
.500 guns or whatever would be shooting up in given areas because they knew where your target was going to be, or at least had a pretty good idea because you're flying straight and level. To bomb that target, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, so you were targets. You were, in other words, in a shooting gallery.
Tactics dictated that the bombers flew in tight box formations. It meant that maneuverability was limited, but the overlapping covering fire at least provided some protection from the fighters.
As long as you stayed in tight formation, fighters didn't like to fool with you because there was too many 50 caliber machine guns going to fire on them.
There's 4 of them, 1 o'clock high. They're coming around, watch them.
We couldn't do anything as the crew members. The pilots couldn't do too much evasive action when they were in formation either.
An engine on
They did do in the fighter attacks. They did do a little, but you couldn't move because, you only have so much room to move because the planes were that packed, that tight together.
Round to 10. Watch them, Chuck. Keep your eyes open.
They're breaking at 11. Breaking at 11.
I got them. He's coming around underneath at 10 o'clock.
I got those two at 2 o'clock.
Watch them, Scotty.
I got my sights on them.
Check that B-17, Chuck. 3 o'clock. Motor smoking. Fighter's 10:30 coming around.
Those 10:30 upper or lower?
It was a numbing experience, believe me, and you did a lot of praying that you get through this without being killed, that the plane would just survive, that you would survive.
Throughout 1942, the concept had been sound enough, but by 1943, the Luftwaffe was able to send hundreds of fighters up to intercept the bombers.
They were looking for the first stragglers, the first one that started trailing smoke, the first one that was starting to fall back. As soon as he fell out, wham! And they'd have him. They'd come in groups of 5 like that. You go down, and maybe they'd get people out of the aircraft, maybe they wouldn't. It was really hard to say.
We got there. We saw nothing but German fighters. None of our own were operational in the air, and we encountered heavy resistance, and the planes went down. Just, 60 aircraft were lost. In fact, after the mission, we were stood down, which means that we did not fly missions for a long period of time.
Crew losses were becoming unsustainable. During the autumn of 1943, they were so high that a pause in the campaign was ordered while commanders considered a change in tactics. It also gave the 8th Air Force a chance to re-equip with new planes and crews. The Luftwaffe was also adapting, equipping their aircraft with heavier weapons. But heavier aircraft were less maneuverable, which put their pilots at a severe disadvantage when the bombing campaign restarted in early 1944. Arguably, the biggest development was the arrival in service of the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt. When equipped with additional fuel tanks, both had the range to reach Germany and return to their bases.
We were a little bit faster. We could turn a little bit shorter, tighter. But they were good planes, and they could take more punishment than the P-51.
The most beautiful airplane in the world, especially if you had an engine shot out and you was coming back on 3 engines, to see them sitting out there. Pilot is calm, would be smoking a cigarette, kind of weighting you down, looking your damage over, and then he'd peel away and get up around. Talk about being little friends. They were friends, and we loved to have them around. You bet.
It was a timely development as both the RAF and 8th Air Force now had a vital task. Allied commanders had agreed that they would invade northern France in the early summer of 1944. If they were to stand any chance of success, they had to have control of the skies. As part of the combined bomber offensive, Operation Pointblank was initiated. The new objective was to attack the Luftwaffe, including its factories, airfields, and air crews. The Luftwaffe had a difficult choice. If it chose not to respond, then it would risk losing the air war without firing a shot. If it did respond, the crews would have to meet the new long-range fighters.
General Anderson's bombers had not always been alone in their invasion of Europe. General Hunter's fighters, powerful thunderbolts in late months, have been accompanying our bombers to the extent of their range. They have had many fights with the German fighters, the best the Germans have, and they have knocked them down at better than 2 to 1. We're winning these air battles inside Europe for 2 principal reasons. The first is because we have better airplanes, better bombers, and better fighters. The second and most important one is because of the skill, courage, and training of our combat crews.
The arrival of the new fighters enabled a change of tactics. Instead of staying with the bombers throughout the mission, the fighters were given the freedom to attack German fighters wherever they found them.
They'd all be flying formation together, not wingtip to wingtip, but they have a little waist so they can move it around a little bit. You didn't have to watch each plane carefully, so you didn't run into each other. Then when we get deep in Germany or over the bombing site, we'd be out in battle formation. In battle formation, the planes would all spread out so that the idea was if you can get proper position, you'll be able to turn without running into one of your planes, and you could turn and face because they're going to be coming down on you from up above and behind you. So you want to be able to turn around and face them.
The P-51 Mustang was more than a match for the new German aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190 and later Mark Messerschmitt, putting them on the back foot.
If everything goes smooth, if they don't get hit, bombers don't get attacked, we'll see what else we can find. Targets of opportunity, we called it. If we can find airfields to strafe, we'll do that. Or if we find trains moving or we find anything military, we'll do that.
The B-17 had also gone through a series of developments from the variants that had arrived in Britain in 1942. The aircraft now bristled with machine guns which had been increased from 7 to 13.
I tell you, that plane was a wonderful plane. Not because that I particularly crewed that plane, but I tell you, those planes, they would fly on almost nothing. I've seen planes come back. Well, our first mission over Hamburg was sub-pens, and we lost 3 crews that day. And we had 67 holes in our airplane when they came back. Right flap was gone, and the big section of the tail was gone. And we had a lot of problems. But that plane brought us back.
The legendary status of the B-17 overshadows the contribution made by the 8th Air Force's other heavy bomber, the B-24 Liberator. Designed and built by Consolidated Aircraft, the distinctive twin-tail Liberator had its origins in the 1930s. It was both faster and carried a substantially larger bomb load than the B-17. Many missions flown by the 8th Air Force throughout the Second World War used both B-17s and Liberators. By the beginning of 1944, there were enough P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts to resume the bombing campaign of Germany. The RAF and U.S. Army Air Force were now operating under the Allied Combined Bombing Offensive. The opening salvo was to be a week-long assault on the German aircraft industry. The aim was to force the Luftwaffe into the air where they would be destroyed by the new fighters. Aircraft could be replaced relatively quickly, but it took longer to train pilots to replace those lost in combat. Operation Argument, or Big Week as it became known, began on the night of the 19th and 20th of February. The RAF mounted a major raid on Leipzig. Using over 800 Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Mosquitoes, their targets were factories where Messerschmitts were being built. The raid did not go well. The bomber stream was attacked relentlessly by night fighters and the flak was heavy. To make matters worse, the main force arrived over the target too early due to stronger winds than had been forecast. This meant they had to orbit the city until the Pathfinder force arrived to mark where they were to drop their bombs. Some 420 aircrew were killed and a further 131 were taken prisoner. It was the heaviest bomber command loss of the war up to that point. The following day, it was the turn of the crews of the 8th Air Force flying from their bases in the east of England. They were joined in the raids by the 15th Air Force flying from Italy. For their first raid on the 20th of February 1944, the Americans launched a force of around 1,000 bombers escorted by over 800 fighters. The main target was also Leipzig, as well as secondary targets like airfields. For the next 5 days, the British and American bombers pounded the German aircraft industry and the Luftwaffe wherever they could be found. Losses were still high, but gradually the Luftwaffe was being ground down in a war of attrition. Initially, German factories were able to keep pace with the losses, but the relentless bombing forced production to be dispersed. What could not be so easily replaced were the pilots lost in air combat with the P-51 Mustangs, many of whom were the most experienced. By April, the Allies had become the masters of the air. The Luftwaffe tried to reinforce its defenses by bringing aircraft and crews back to Germany from occupied Europe. But they could not turn back the tide. The bomber crews had successfully fulfilled their task and met the strategic goal to defeat the Luftwaffe. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Northern Europe, could go ahead, secure in the knowledge that the troops landing on the beaches would face little risk from aerial attack. During the landings, hardly any Luftwaffe aircraft were seen, such was the dominance of the Allied air forces. Although the strategic bombing campaign continued, the new priority in the run-up to D-Day was to disrupt infrastructure to prevent as much as possible the Germans' reinforcements reaching Normandy. The heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force and RAF were sent to attack targets in support of the ground forces as they advanced through France. The missions could be just as dangerous, but at least they were much shorter. The 8th Air Force had grown to a strength of over 200,000 personnel. It could send 2,004 engine bombers and 1,000 fighters on a single mission to attack targets in Europe. Not surprisingly, it became known as the Mighty 8th. But it came at a cost. More than 47,000 became casualties with over 26,000 killed. RAF Bomber Command had also reached its peak of destructive power with over 1,500 bombers. But it too paid a high price in lost crews. Over 55,000 were killed, the highest of any unit fighting during the Second World War except for the submarine service. Thousands of brave young men flew in the iconic aircraft of the Allied Air Forces, knowing the dangers they faced with each mission. The skies over Europe were a battleground that lasted nearly 5 years. For those who survived, the intensity of the experience shared by both officers and other ranks created a comradeship that began when they were bomber boys and lasted for the rest of their lives.
In the evenings, when you were stood down, you went off to the pub together. You slept in the same premises. A crew was a crew was a crew, and you really thought of it. You knew what all the other chaps thought about things. You knew what made them irritable. You knew what made them pleased. You had a sense for each other's, and you knew that you had to get on.
As I remember, it was just a matter of you living a day at a time, and you didn't dwell on what was coming up next, because you weren't going to get shot down anyway. You were going to make it.
But the number of losses tell a sobering story. Thousands of Allied bomber aircraft were lost in Europe, and tens of thousands of crew members perished or became prisoners of war. The magnitude of their sacrifice is a testament to their courage and unwavering resolve. Although the Allies built thousands of 4-engine bombers, just 2 flying examples survive in Europe today. Over 7,000 Lancasters were built, and the one surviving example in Europe flies as part of the RAF's Battle of Britain Memorial Flight and is regularly seen on state occasions and air shows. As with all the flight's aircraft, it is crewed and maintained by regular RAF personnel. Over the years, it has flown in several different markings to commemorate the squadrons and crews who took part in the bombing campaign. Its appearance in the sky, escorted by Spitfires and Hurricanes from the BBMF, never ceases to enthrall and inspire those who come to see them, even though most were born long after the war ended. Although over 12,000 B-17s were built, there is only one flying example left in Europe. Widely known as Sally B, it is a G variant. Delivered to the U.S. Army Air Force just after the end of the war, it was used as a flying platform for various research projects. It was then sold to the French government to carry out survey work. In 1975, it was sold into private hands and brought to Britain. There, it began a new career as a flying memorial to the American airmen, who became casualties in the skies over Europe during the Second World War. Both the Lancaster and B-17 are popular regulars at air displays. They fly as living memorials to the brave Allied bomber boys who gave their all in the skies over Europe. Their bravery and sacrifice will never be forgotten, and their legacy lives on in our enduring freedom.